Welcome to Sleep Shaper, your destination for expertly crafted sleep stories that help you fall asleep faster and deeper. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight as we embark on a journey to unwind and embrace the comfort of a cozy winter evening. Tonight, we'll settle into this peaceful space, allowing the gentle rhythms of the fire and the quiet stillness of the evening to guide us into relaxation. With each moment, the noise of the world fades away, leaving only the comforting warmth of the fire, the flicker of candlelight, and the soft glow of a winter evening. Before we begin, I invite you to find a comfortable spot to settle into, whether you're nestled in bed, lounging in your favorite chair, or wrapped in your favorite blanket. Allow your body to relax and melt into the warmth around you. As you settle back, allow yourself to take a slow, deep breath. Inhale through your nose, feeling the air fill your lungs, and then exhale gently through your mouth, releasing any tension with it. Let the rhythm of your breath become slow and steady, deepening with each moment. With every exhale, feel your body grow lighter, as though you're letting go of the day, releasing the weight of everything that came before this moment. Picture yourself wrapped in the warmth of a soft, cozy blanket. Feel the comfort of the fabric against your skin, soft and inviting, like an old friend. Each thread of the blanket, woven with love and care, embraces you, offering you a sense of security and calm. The room around you is quiet, the only sound, the gentle crackling of a fire. The flames dance, casting flickering shadows on the walls, their movements slow and graceful, as though time itself has decided to pause for a while. The air smells faintly of pine and wax, the warmth of the fire filling the space with a soft, soothing glow. In this peaceful moment, the world outside feels distant. The wind howls softly beyond the windows, but here, inside, it's calm. You can hear the gentle rhythm of the wind, like a lullaby, as it caresses the house. The snow falls silently, its soft touch adding to the stillness, creating a peaceful quietness that wraps around you like the blanket you're nestled in. Feel the warmth of the fire, the steady, comforting pulse of the flickering flames as it spreads throughout your body. From the tips of your toes to the top of your head, let each muscle relax deeper into the softness beneath you. Your body feels heavier with each breath, but it's a gentle heaviness, a warm, cozy embrace that allows you to sink further into peace. Let go of any lingering thoughts. There's nothing you need to do right now. All that matters is the warmth, the quiet, and the deep, steady rhythm of your breath. Let each exhale carry away any tension, and with every inhale, fill yourself with a sense of calm. As you relax even further, feel yourself gently floating in this peaceful space, safe and secure, surrounded by warmth and soft light. The house, with its familiar sounds, its soft candlelight, and its stillness, holds you in a cocoon of comfort. You are here, in this moment, fully present and completely at ease. Allow yourself to be cradled by this quiet, this stillness, as the evening draws on. All you need to do now is breathe. Feel your body relax deeper with each breath, each exhale loosening the grip of the day, each inhale bringing in calm, peaceful energy. With every passing moment, you are more at ease, safe, calm, ready to surrender into this quiet sanctuary of warmth and peace.
The evening fell softly, like the world itself had been wrapped in a thick, silencing blanket of snow. Outside, the wind whispered against the window panes, a low, soothing murmur that came in gusts, brushing the edges of the house with a chill that could almost be felt through the walls. Inside, warmth clung to the air, drawing her in like a lover's embrace. The flickering glow of candles bathed the room in a golden haze, their soft light flickering gently like quiet breaths. The shadows stretched long and thin across the floorboards, stretching toward her like memories, reaching out from places only half remembered. Elena had come home. The house, old and familiar, embraced her the moment she stepped inside, as though it had been waiting for her return. She hadn't needed to return in years, not since she'd left for the city, eager to escape the weight of the past. But now, after the messy unraveling of a relationship that had once seemed so promising, she found herself seeking refuge in the warmth of her childhood home, a place filled with both the sweetness of forgotten days and the ache of memories that had long since faded into the past. The room around her was peaceful, still, as if time itself had slowed its pace. The air smelled faintly of wax and pine, a mix of familiar, comforting scents that calmed her scattered thoughts. The faint crackle of the fire in the hearth played a soothing melody, its warm glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. She pulled the thick, worn blanket tighter around her shoulders, its soft fibers wrapping her in a cocoon of warmth, the kind only a piece of fabric worn down by years of use could provide. With the blanket around her shoulders, she curled into the armchair by the fire, sinking into the soft upholstery, letting the warmth from the flames ease the tightness in her muscles. She could feel the heat from the hearth seep into her skin, the sensation grounding her, pulling her deeper into the tranquility of the space. The crackling of the fire became a rhythmic lullaby, each burst of sound from the logs settling deep into her bones. Her fingers brushed over the edge of a photograph on the mantel, a picture she hadn't seen in years. A snapshot of happier times, the edges yellowing slightly with age. A smile tugged at her lips as she traced the outline of the image. Her parents, their laughter frozen in time, their eyes wide with joy. She let her mind drift, the glow of the candles blurring the line between past and present. The house, full of memories both tender and painful, seemed to wrap around her like the blanket she had draped over her shoulders. For a while, everything was still. The world outside seemed distant, muffled by the heavy snowstorm that raged just beyond the windows. Time stretched out, and Elena allowed herself to sink further into the comfort of the space, her mind wandering freely in the gentle embrace of nostalgia. Then, as if stirred by some unseen force, there came a soft knock at the door. Gentle at first, like the tap of a timid finger on a window pane. Tap, tap, tap. Elena's breath caught in her chest, the stillness of the room shattered by the sound. The fire crackled louder for a moment, and her heart quickened in a way she couldn't quite explain. The warmth from the flames seemed to fade just a little, leaving a subtle chill in the air. She paused, her mind still wrapped in the quiet, and then, after a breath, just one long pause, she rose slowly from her seat, feeling the soft fabric of the blanket brush against her skin as she moved. Her feet made no sound against the wooden floorboards as she walked toward the door, the stillness of the house enveloping her with each step. The wind outside howled, pushing against the house, but within there was only a gentle calm. The moment she reached the door, the cold air from outside swept in briefly, causing the candles to flicker wildly before settling back into their calm glow. Opening the door, Elena found Luca standing on the threshold. He was the man who lived next door. The neighbor who had always been a quiet presence in the background of her life, a man who had been there through the years, but had never really seemed to be there, if that made sense. His expression, warm but uncertain, greeted her as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking not quite sure of himself. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice soft and almost swallowed by the howling wind. "Have you seen a dog?" "My dog? He ran off when the storm started." The sound of his voice broke through the air, and Elena blinked, her mind momentarily caught in a fog. She nodded slowly, the wind making her skin prickle briefly as it entered the house. It felt sharp, almost as though it carried more than just cold with it. Something heavier, something she couldn't quite place. The door closed behind him, but Luca didn't leave. Not immediately. He stood just beyond the threshold, his body half turned as though waiting for something. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made her chest tighten. "Would you mind if I stayed for a while?" he asked, his voice low, carrying with it a quiet sincerity. It wasn't a request so much as a quiet plea, something Elena couldn't ignore. Elena hesitated, a strange unease rising in her chest, despite the warmth that still wrapped around her. Her mind told her she was being paranoid, but something about his presence here at this moment felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it. "Not yet." "You can come in, but only for a little while," she said, her voice warmer than she felt. There was a hint of hesitation in her words, a thread of unease that didn't quite match the calm of the space around her. As the door closed behind him, the house seemed to take him in, the warm air almost welcoming him, enveloping him as if it had been waiting for him just as much as it had been waiting for her return. Luca settled into the chair across from Eleanor, his figure sinking into the shadows that the flickering candlelight stretched long across the room. The room, once quiet, now felt alive with the soft, rhythmic sound of the fire crackling in the hearth. The orange glow from the flames danced on the walls, casting flickers of light that played like whispers across their faces. The soft scent of pine and burning wood mixed with the subtle fragrance of tea curling through the air like a warm invitation. Eleanor handed him a delicate cup, the porcelain cool beneath her fingers. As his hand brushed hers in the exchange, a gentle warmth lingered, a fleeting but intimate connection that felt soft against the weight of her thoughts. The steam rose from the tea, swirling in delicate tendrils, twisting and spiraling into the still air like the memories of her past. Luca brought the cup to his lips, his gaze momentarily lingering on her before he took a slow sip. The warmth of the tea seemed to relax him, the tension in his posture easing slightly as he leaned back into his chair. "I used to come here, you know," he said, breaking the silence in his soft, steady voice. There was a hint of nostalgia. In his tone, the words laced with a quiet weight. "When we were younger, before everything changed." Elena's eyes softened as she listened. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her own cup, feeling the warmth seep through the thin porcelain. She could hear the sound of the wind howling outside, a distant hum that seemed to echo through the walls. But inside, it was calm, cozy, as though time itself had stopped. "I remember," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You were always the quiet one, but I always felt like you had a story to tell. You just never shared it." Luca chuckled softly. The deep rumble of his laughter warm and grounding, as though it was wrapped in the same comfort the room offered. The sound seemed to fill the space between them, softening the edges of her unease, pulling her deeper into the moment. It was a laughter that carried a gentleness in its tone, a sound that was comforting in its simplicity. The way his smile reached his eyes, bringing a warmth to his otherwise serious expression, made Elena feel as if they were both in on a shared secret. For a while, they spoke of small things, mundane memories that once felt ordinary, but now, in the dim glow of the firelight, felt treasured, precious. The past unfolded gently between them, the stories drifting like dust motes in the soft light. They spoke of school days, of the smell of freshly baked bread from her mother's kitchen, of the quiet nights spent watching the stars through the big window in the living room. Elena laughed, her laughter mingling with his, a sound so soothing it felt like it could anchor her to this moment forever. The storm outside, once fierce and howling, seemed to fade into the background, reduced to a soft murmur, as if it had no place in the warmth of the house. The world beyond the windows no longer seemed real, as if it were all a distant dream, a world locked outside the walls of this home. The only world that mattered now was the space between them, where the fire crackled softly and the air was thick with memories and comfort. Yet, as time passed, a subtle shift began to stir within Eleanor. She couldn't place it, an odd sensation, like a faint tugging at the edges of her awareness. It wasn't enough to push her away, but it was there, like an unanswered question that had begun to linger in her mind. It was in the way the shadows danced along the walls, their shapes becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. With diesen, flames from the hearth flickered in time with her thoughts, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward the corners of the room. Her gaze drifted over to the window, where the snow fell in soft swirls, each flake illuminated by the pale light from the candles. But when she looked back at Luca, she found his eyes on her. His gaze was steady, unblinking, almost too intense for comfort. There was something in the way he watched her, a quiet intensity that made her heart skip a beat. She shifted in her chair, the soft fabric of the blanket rustling around her shoulders. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow just beyond the edge of the room, drifting for a split second, and then disappearing. The candle on the table wavered, as if stirred by an unseen breeze. Elena blinked, unsure if it was the shadows playing tricks on her, or if there was something more. She looked back at Luca, but he hadn't moved. His smile remained, warm but distant, as though he were caught in a thought she couldn't access. "Did you see that?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile calm. Luca's head tilted slightly, his brow furrowing. "See what?" The question seemed almost innocent, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the way he spoke or even his expression. It was something about the space between them, the strange energy that had begun to creep into the room. The silence hung heavy for a moment before Luca cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "I'm sure it's just the wind," he said, his tone light, brushing off her unease. But Elena couldn't let go of the sensation that had crept up on her, like the house was alive, watching, waiting. The candle flickered again, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. Elena glanced toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather just a little too densely. But when she looked again, everything was still. For a moment, the world outside, the storm, the night, felt very far away. The house, with its warmth and flickering light, seemed to pull them deeper into a quiet, hazy cocoon. But there, in the quiet spaces between their words, Elena couldn't help but feel that the night was far from ordinary. And Luca, his smile still warm, seemed to be at the center of it all. The storm outside had intensified, its fury now a constant low roar. The wind howled like an untamed animal, pressing against the windows as if it were trying to force its way inside. But inside the house, the warmth from the hearth and the flickering candles kept the cold at bay. The fire crackled and popped, sending soft bursts of light across the room, its warmth seeping deeper into Elena's skin. But despite the coziness that enveloped her, something in the air had changed as the minutes ticked by. The peaceful atmosphere that had once embraced her began to feel heavier, thick with an energy she couldn't quite place. The house, familiar and welcoming, had started to feel like a different place. The walls seemed to hum softly, as though the very space around her was alive, waiting for something or someone. The warmth that had once been comforting now felt stifling, pressing in on her chest with every breath she took. Luca, who had been speaking in a steady, rhythmic cadence, paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing just slightly. For the briefest moment, his expression shifted, his gaze sharp and focused, like a predator assessing its surroundings. But then, just as quickly, his smile returned, as if nothing had happened. The subtle change in the room didn't escape.
Eleanor. She shifted uneasily in her chair, her fingers tightening around the delicate teacup she held.
The porcelain was warm against her skin, but it did little to ease the discomfort that was building within her. She felt her body respond to the change, a quiet tension tightening in her muscles, and her thoughts growing more scattered. The shadows, once gentle and fleeting, had started to shift on their own. Elena glanced up, her gaze lingering on the walls where the candlelight painted long, twisted shapes across the surfaces. A dark corner of the room seemed to stretch in a way that wasn't natural, as if the shadows themselves were alive, moving with a purpose she couldn't understand. Her heart skipped in her chest. Luca continued speaking, but his words seemed to float just out of her grasp, their meaning lost in the growing unease. Her eyes kept drifting back to the corner of the room, where the shadows stretched unnaturally long. Her gaze flickered to the clock on the mantel. She hadn't noticed it before, but the hands, moving just a little too quickly, seemed to mock her sense of time. The steady ticking of the clock had once been comforting, but now it felt invasive, like it was counting down to something inevitable. She blinked and looked back at Luca. He hadn't noticed her distraction, his gaze focused
On her as if he were waiting for her to respond.
But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the air, something more than just the storm outside. The air itself felt different, charged in a way she couldn't describe. It was as if the house had taken a deep, slow breath, and now it was waiting to exhale. "Have you found your dog?" Elena asked, her voice coming out quieter than she intended, the words almost lost in the hum of the room. She wasn't sure why she asked, perhaps to break the tension, to return to something ordinary. But as soon as the words left her lips, she regretted them. The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Luca's eyes darkened for the briefest moment, the shadows under his brow deepening as he looked at her. His smile faded for just a second, like the curtain had been pulled back to reveal something hidden beneath. But when he spoke, his voice was as steady and controlled as ever, though there was something colder behind it. "No, not yet," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But he's around here somewhere, I'm sure of it." Elena's stomach tightened. The way he said it, his certainty, the weight in his tone, stirred something dark inside her. She didn't know why, but the words felt wrong. It wasn't the idea of a lost dog that unsettled her. It was something else, something in the way Luca's gaze lingered on her, as though he knew more than he was letting on. She turned away, her mind spinning. The shadows, once subtle, had begun to twist and writhe in the corners of the room, their shapes now exaggerated, stretching unnaturally. The candles flickered, their flames dancing violently, casting sharp, distorted shapes along the walls. She could hear the wind growing louder outside, the sound of it clawing against the house, but inside, everything felt unnervingly still. The temperature in the room had dropped, the warmth of the fire suddenly feeling too far away. Elena's breath came out in a soft puff, visible in the air. She shivered involuntarily, her blanket now feeling too thin, the warmth from the hearth inadequate against the strange chill creeping into her bones. Another flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow, but this one wasn't a trick of the candlelight. It was real. It shifted with purpose, as though it had a life of its own. She turned her head quickly, but the corner was empty again. Her pulse quickened. The knock at the door came again, this time more insistent, louder. The sound reverberated through the room, slicing through the thick, tense air. But it wasn't the wind this time. No, it was deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone or something was waiting outside. Elena's heart raced. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. Her breath quickened, the weight of her own unease pressing down on her chest. She looked at Luca, but he hadn't moved. He was still seated, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a jolt of cold fear running down her spine. Without saying a word, she made her way to the door, her feet moving slowly, deliberately. The room seemed to close in around her as she approached the door, the flickering flames casting long, jagged shadows in the dimness. The air felt thick as she reached for the doorknob, and for a moment it seemed as though the house held its breath. She turned the handle, her hand trembling slightly, and pulled the door open. But there was no one there. The wind howled louder, sweeping into the house with icy fingers, causing the flames in the candles to dance violently before they settled back into a soft glow. The snowstorm outside raged, its white fury blending with the darkness, creating a blank canvas of swirling flakes. Elena stepped back, confusion settling in. No one had knocked. There was no one there, just the storm. Turning back to the room, she found Luca standing, his eyes fixed on her. The warmth of the room had vanished. The fire still crackled, but the heat no longer seemed to reach her. The space between them had grown, the once comforting presence of the house now feeling like a weight upon her chest. Luca's smile never faltered, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Are you sure you want to leave?" he asked softly, his voice low, barely a whisper. The question seemed to hang in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Eleanor stood frozen in place, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The house felt like it was waiting for something. The shadows, the strange knocks, the temperature dropping. It was all too much, too strange to ignore. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. The knock at the door hung in the air, echoing through the stillness of the room, reverberating like a pulse in the back of Elena's mind. Her feet were frozen in place, her breath shallow, as if the sound itself had rooted her to the floor. The wind outside howled like a wild thing, pressing against the house with an urgency that matched her racing heartbeat. The flames in the hearth crackled, sending flickers of light that danced erratically across the room, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to whisper. The sound came again, this time more deliberate, more rhythmic. There was no mistaking it now. It wasn't the wind. It was someone, or something, knocking. Elena felt a chill creep down her spine, and for a long moment she simply stood there, unable to move. Her eyes darted toward Luca, but his figure remained still, rooted to the chair across from her. His eyes never left her, his gaze steady and unblinking, almost too calm for the tension that hung thick in the air. His lips, curved into a quiet, almost knowing smile, betrayed nothing of the unease that was flooding her own senses. Slowly, almost mechanically, Eleanor stepped toward the door. The candlelight flickered wildly as she passed, and she could feel the shift in the air, thick with something she couldn't name, something that whispered that the world had tilted just slightly off its axis. The warmth from the fire no longer seemed to reach her. She could almost feel the cold creeping into her bones as she approached the door, like the very walls of the house were pressing in, urging her to stay. With each step toward the entrance, the house seemed to grow quieter, the wind outside muffling into a low hum. Her skin prickled as she reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from a creeping unease. The door seemed heavier than it should have been, as if it were resisting her touch, reluctant to open. The sound of the wind howling against the house was deafening now, but it was drowned out by the strange silence that seemed to have settled inside the room. Eleanor's hand closed around the knob, and she turned it slowly, the sound of the click echoing in her ears. As the door creaked open, the gust of cold air that rushed in felt like a slap against her face. The firelight flickered violently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch hungrily toward the doorway. But there was no one. The world outside was swallowed by the storm, a blur of white against the night. Snowflakes spun in the wind, caught in the fury of the tempest, but there was nothing there, no one waiting in the cold, no one knocking at the door. Just the relentless howl of the wind and the deafening silence of the snowstorm. Elena stood, frozen for a moment, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Her eyes scanned the empty doorstep, then the quiet street beyond. There was no one. No sign of movement, no footprints in the snow, just the storm, the endless, unyielding storm. She stepped back, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, and closed the door with a soft click. The house, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt suffocating. The walls, the flickering lights, the warmth, it all seemed to press in on her, making it harder to breathe. Turning back toward the room, Elena's eyes met Luca's. His gaze was fixed on her, the intensity in his eyes unsettling. His lips parted slightly, and the softest of smiles tugged at the corners of his mouth, but there was something in his expression that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the warmth of a comforting smile, it was something else, something cold, something hollow. "I think I should go," Elena said, the words barely a whisper. The strange tension that had settled over the room made her voice tremble, and she was certain Luca could hear it. But as she turned to gather her things, the atmosphere in the room shifted once again. The warmth from the fire seemed to retreat even further, and the room felt colder now, the air heavier, as though it were filled with 1,000 unspoken words. The hum of the house, the soft, almost imperceptible buzz that had become so familiar, grew louder. It was no longer just the crackling of the fire. It felt as though the house itself was alive, its very walls thrumming with something ancient and unspoken. Eleanor's legs felt like lead as she stood, unable to take a step toward the door. Her gaze lingered on Luca once more, his figure still, seated, unmoving, watching her with those unblinking eyes. His silence was suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask him what was going on, but the words caught in her throat. The temperature had dropped again. This time she could see her breath, a pale mist that lingered in the air just for a moment. The shadows in the room stretched longer, as if the dark corners of the house were reaching out to claim her. Luca stood slowly, the movement deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something predatory in the way he moved now, a quiet grace that unsettled her more than it should have. "Are you sure you want to leave?" His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried an edge to it that sent a jolt of cold fear straight through Elena. She could feel the weight of his words, heavy and insistent, as if they were pulling at something deep inside her, something she couldn't name. Her heart raced in her chest, and she took a step back, her mind spinning, her thoughts a tangled mess. The air was thick, and she could feel the pulse of the house vibrating through the floorboards. It was waiting for something hidden in the corners, beneath the floorboards, between the walls. Elena wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. The house seemed to have a hold on her now, its grip tightening with every passing second. The shadows grew longer, twisting and writhing like living things. The candlelight, once warm and welcoming, now flickered with an unnatural energy, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. The room felt too small. The walls seemed to press in on her, the air too thick to breathe. The house was alive with something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment, and now it was awake. Luca's gaze never wavered, his figure a silhouette in the dim light. Elena felt his presence like a weight on her chest, and she knew, deep down, that the house wasn't just a house anymore. It was something darker, something far more dangerous, and then in the silence the house exhaled. The house seemed to close in around Elena, the walls pressing inward, the air thick with an oppressive weight. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a reminder that the space she had once found so familiar now felt like a trap. The fire in the hearth crackled louder than before, the sound harsh and discordant, as though it too was reacting to the shifting atmosphere. The flames leapt higher, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, stretching across the room like dark fingers reaching out for her. Elena's heart raced in her chest, thudding painfully with each beat. The warmth from the fire seemed distant now, too far away to comfort her. The blanket around her shoulders felt heavier, suffocating. The room, once a safe haven, had become something else entirely. Something dark and oppressive, filled with an ancient presence that pulsed in the very walls. It was as if the house itself had come alive, and now it was waiting. Luca stood across from her, his figure a silhouette in the dim candlelight. His eyes glinted with an unnerving intensity, his expression unreadable, though there was something in his gaze that made her stomach twist with unease. The shadows seemed to shift around him, the space between them growing thicker, denser. The air hummed with a low, vibrating energy, and Elena could feel it deep in her bones, thrumming with an unsettling rhythm. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as though the very air had thickened, making each step feel like a struggle. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, but somehow unsteady, as if the house itself was shifting beneath her, its foundation slowly crumbling. The walls seemed to sway, and for a brief moment, Eleanor felt as if she were trapped in a dream, the edges of reality blurring into something she couldn't quite grasp. The candlelight flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the room. The flames danced erratically, each one a reflection of the chaos building in her mind. She could hear the wind outside, howling like a beast trapped in a cage, but inside everything was silent. The silence was deafening, thick and suffocating, broken only by the soft hiss of the fire and the quiet hum of the house. Luca's voice cut through the stillness, low and steady. "You're afraid, aren't you?" The words were not a question, but a statement, and yet Elena couldn't deny them. Fear twisted in her chest, its grip tightening with every passing second. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words were caught in her throat. Her mind raced, torn between the need to escape and the strange compulsion to stay, to understand, to confront whatever this was that had taken root in the house. Luca's smile remained, but it was no longer warm. There was something dark in it now, something cold and knowing, as if he had always been a part of the house, as if he had always been waiting for this moment. Elena. His voice lingered in the air like a soft whisper, a shiver running down her spine. You knew it was never just a house. You've always known. Her pulse quickened. His words cut through her like a knife, slicing through the veil of confusion she had been holding on to. Always known? What did he mean? The memories, the laughter, the warmth, the comfort had all been real, hadn't they? Or had they been part of the house's illusion, a carefully woven thread in a tapestry that was slowly unraveling? The shadows grew longer, darker, and Eleanor could feel them moving, could feel the house breathing with a life of its own. The air was thick with the smell of wax and pine, but now there was something else, a faint, acrid scent, like the smoke of something burning just beyond her reach. She looked around, searching for the source, but there was only the suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch farther than the room itself. The house was closing in. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the very walls were pressing in on her, urging her to collapse into the shadows that now filled every corner. The candle flames flickered one last time, casting a faint, eerie glow on Luca's face. He was no longer just the man from next door. He was something more, something darker, something tied to the house itself. Elena, he repeated, his voice soft, almost tender now, but it held an undercurrent of something dangerous. You've come back. You've always come back. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of his words pressed down on her, and she could feel the panic rising in her throat. Had she always come back to this house, to this moment, to him? Luca took a step forward, and the air seemed to shift with his movement. The room grew colder, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. The house hummed louder now, vibrating beneath her feet, filling her senses with its presence. The floor creaked as she stepped backward, trying to put distance between herself and him. But the house had closed off all exits. The walls were no longer walls. They were barriers, closing her in, hemming her in, trapping her in this moment. You were always meant to stay, Luca murmured, his voice slipping into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like smoke. The house called to you. It always calls. Her heart seemed to stutter in her chest, and the world around her tilted. She reached out for the chair beside her, her fingers trembling as they grasped the edge, grounding herself against the overwhelming wave of fear that threatened to swallow her whole. The house. It wasn't just a place. It wasn't just brick and mortar and candlelight. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for her. Waiting for this moment. Waiting for the final thread to unravel. She looked at Luca again. His form was now lost in the shadows, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark, watching her with the quiet intensity of something ancient. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and terror. The house breathed around her, its energy pulsing through the walls, the floor, the air itself. It wasn't just the wind outside, the storm beyond the windows. It was the house that had been waiting for her to understand, waiting for her to accept it. And then, with a final flicker of candlelight, the room dimmed. The shadows consumed the last of the warmth, the last of the light. The air was still, impossibly still. Elena closed her eyes, and for a moment she let go of the fear. She surrendered to the darkness, to the hum of the house, to the pull of something beyond her understanding. The final glow of the evening faded, swallowed by the house's embrace.